Imagine for a moment an endless plain under a merciless sun, a landscape where dust and silence seem to be the only legitimate inhabitants. In this setting, which many would find monotonous and empty, the most important work of the Spanish language was born, arguably the very pillar upon which all modern narrative rests. We are not simply talking about an adventure book or a satire of chivalric romances. We are facing a literary artifact so complex and multidimensional that, 400 years after its publication, it continues to challenge our notions of sanity, identity, and the very structure of reality. Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra, a man who knew military glory at the Battle of Lepanto and absolute misery in the prisons of Algiers and Spain itself, poured into these pages not only his wit, but his profound understanding of the human condition. To understand the impact of Don Quixote, we must place ourselves in the context of Spain at the end of the 16th and beginning of the 17th century. It was an empire where the sun never set, yet it was beginning to show the cracks of a deep economic and moral decline. The ideals of medieval chivalry, those codes of honor, sacrifice, and courtly love, had become obsolete in the face of gunpowder, commerce, and a stifling state bureaucracy. Cervantes, with an irony that is both cruel and deeply compassionate, decides to take these remnants of a world that no longer exists and place them in the mind of an impoverished 50-year-old nobleman. This premise, which in the hands of any other writer would have been a simple mockery, becomes under Cervantes' pen a philosophical deconstruction of how we perceive the world and how the world perceives us. This forces us to dive into the figure of Alonso Quijano, a man of hardy constitution, gaunt features, and a withered face, who from reading so many books of chivalry dried up his brain and lost his mind. But what does it actually mean to lose one's mind in this context? Modern psychologists often analyze Quixote's behavior not as a common psychosis, but as an act of radical will. Quijano does not just go mad, he decides to become someone else. He constructs a new identity for himself, chooses a sonorous name, seeks an idealized beloved, and rescues from a dusty corner some weapons that belong to his great-grandparents. This metamorphosis is the first great act of existential rebellion in literature. By transforming into Don Quixote, the protagonist rejects the mediocrity of his daily life and embraces a higher purpose, even if that purpose is based on fiction. The plot begins with his first sally, a solitary expedition that ends in disaster but serves to set the tone of the work, the constant collision between internal idealism and external material reality. It is in the second sally where the narrative reaches its perfect balance with the appearance of Sancho Panza. Sancho is not just the comic relief or the realistic counterpoint, he is the other half of the human psyche. If Don Quixote represents the spirit, the longing for transcendence and divine madness, Sancho represents the body, the need for food, and folk wisdom anchored to the earth. However, what makes this relationship revolutionary is that both characters do not remain static. Throughout their journeys, Don Quixote becomes Sanchified and Sancho becomes Quixotized. Sancho begins to dream of islands and the glory of governorship, while Don Quixote, wounded and weary, begins to understand the harshness of a world that does not conform to his rules of chivalry. This duality inevitably leads us to one of the most iconic episodes in world literature, the battle against the windmills. This moment is often interpreted as the ultimate proof of the knight's madness, but if we look at it through a more analytical lens, we discover something much deeper. To Don Quixote, the windmills are not windmills, they are giants. He is not seeing something that doesn't exist, he is reinterpreting what he sees through a different ethical and narrative framework. Where Sancho sees useful technology for grinding grain, the nobleman sees oppressive forces that must be fought. This is the essence of Cervantine perspectivism. Cervantes suggests that reality is not a monolithic block of absolute truths, but a construction that depends on who is looking at it. This is brilliantly exemplified by the object known as the helmet of Mambrino, which to the rest of the world is simply a barber's basin, a metal bowl used for shaving. The dispute over whether the object is a helmet or a basin occupies entire pages and ends with the creation of a new word, the basin helmet. This linguistic invention is an acknowledgement that two contradictory truths can coexist in the same space if there is a will for dialogue. The genius of the work lies in the fact that Cervantes does not limit himself to telling an adventure story, but uses every encounter on the road to reflect on justice, love, freedom, and literature itself. But to understand this fully, we must look at the internal structure of the novel, which is surprisingly modern. Cervantes uses a narrative device that today we would call metafiction. He claims that he is not the original author of the story, but is simply translating a manuscript found in a market in Toledo, written by an Arabic historian named Sidi Hamete Benengeli. By doing this, Cervantes introduces a layer of distance and doubt. If the historian is Arab, and in the Spain of that era Arabs were viewed with suspicion, can we believe what he is telling us? This technique forces the reader to be an active and critical participant, to question the source of information, and to understand that truth is always a mediation. This complexity is elevated to its maximum power in the second part of the work, published 10 years after the first. In this second volume, the fictional characters know that a book about them exists. Don Quixote and Sancho meet people who have read the first part of their adventures. This creates an infinite house of mirrors where the characters must deal with their own fame and the public image that others have built of them. It is, in essence, the first literary reflection on the phenomenon of celebrity and how the perception of others can hijack our own identity. This level of narrative self-awareness allows us to explore the psychology of the characters with a depth that was non-existent at the time. Don Quixote is not a one-dimensional hero. He is a man who suffers, who doubts, and who, in moments of lucidity, feels the weight of his own farce. On the other hand, the figure of Dulcinea del Toboso is perhaps the most fascinating concept in the entire work. Dulcinea never physically appears in the novel. She is a mental construction, an absolute ideal that Don Quixote projects onto a real peasant woman named Aldonza Lorenzo, who was said to have a very good hand for salting pork. Dulcinea's physical absence makes her invulnerable and eternal. She represents everything that is worth fighting for, even when we know it is unattainable. Narrative experts often point out that Dulcinea is the engine of Don Quixote's will. Without that ideal, he would return to being the sad and grey Alonso Quijano. This teaches us a vital lesson about human psychology. We need fictions to survive reality. Without a purpose that transcends the purely biological, existence becomes an unbearable vacuum. Cervantes, through his Night, tells us that it is preferable to die for a beautiful dream than to live a long and secure life devoid of meaning. It is imperative now to turn our gaze toward the social criticism that underlies every chapter. Through the eyes of a madman, Cervantes allows himself to speak truths that a sane man could not utter without the risk of ending up at the stake of the Inquisition. The nobleman criticizes the corruption of judges, the arrogance of nobles, the hypocrisy of the clergy, and the cruelty of a society that amuses itself at the expense of others' suffering. A heartbreaking example of this is the protagonist's stay at the Duke and Duchess's palace in the second part. The dukes, people of high rank and supposed education, devote all their time and resources to orchestrating cruel and humiliating pranks against Don Quixote and Sancho. Here, the roles are reversed. The sane prove to be mean-spirited and lacking in empathy, while the madman and the peasant demonstrate a dignity and nobility of spirit that their hosts can never achieve. Sancho Panza, during his brief governorship of the island of Barataria, shows a judicial wisdom that puts the courts of the time to shame. His judgments are fair, swift, and based on common sense, proving that true leadership capacity does not depend on lineage, but on kindness and the careful observation of reality. This inevitably brings us to another crucial aspect, the use of language as a tool of power and creation. Multiple linguistic registers coexist in the novel, from the archaic and pompous language of the chivalry books used by Don Quixote to the vivid folk proverbs of Sancho, as well as legal, ecclesiastical, and poetic language. Cervantes handles these registers with absolute mastery, making language itself another character. The dialogue between the knight and the squire is the beating heart of the book. It is through the spoken word that bridges are built between their two worlds. At first, they barely understand each other, but by the end of the work, they have created a shared language, a form of communication that transcends their differences in class and education. This linguistic evolution is a reflection of a deep friendship, perhaps the most beautiful friendship in the history of literature. They look after each other, scold each other, admire each other, and above all, they need each other. Don Quixote's loneliness would be unbearable without Sancho's earthly presence, and Sancho's life would be a succession of lusterless days without his master's overflowing imagination. However, to fully understand the significance of this work, we must consider its ending, which is one of the most melancholy and profound moments ever written. Don Quixote is finally defeated, not by giants or sorcerers, but by another knight, the Knight of the White Moon, who is none other than his neighbor Samson Carrasco in disguise. The defeat does not occur on an epic battlefield but on a beach in Barcelona. The condition of the defeat is that Don Quixote must return to his village and abandon his arms for 1 year. This return is the beginning of the end. Once stripped of his armor and his purpose, the knight collapses. Upon arriving home, he falls ill and in a tragic twist regains his sanity. He becomes Alonso Quijano the Good once again, but this recovery of judgment is not a happy ending. It is the victory of grey reality over the luminous imagination. Sancho, in one of the most moving scenes, tries to cheer up his master by asking him to go out into the countryside again, this time disguised as shepherds, to keep living the fiction. But Alonso Quijano can take no more. He dies in his bed, surrounded by his loved ones, having renounced the books that led him to madness, but leaving behind a void impossible to fill. His death marks the end of the era of chivalry and the definitive birth of the modern novel, a novel that feeds on ambiguity, failure, and the complexity of the human soul. But the story of Don Quixote does not end with his physical death on paper. His legacy expands through the centuries, influencing philosophers, painters, musicians, and filmmakers. The current relevance of the work is astonishing if we analyze it from the perspective of our digital age. Today, we are all to some extent inhabitants of a quixotic world. Social media allows us to build avatars, idealized identities that we project to the world, very similar to Don Quixote's armor. We live in information bubbles where we often reinterpret reality to fit our prejudices or ideals, creating our own giants and windmills. Modern neuroscience suggests that our brain does not perceive reality as it is, but makes predictions based on previous experiences and expectations. In essence, we all hallucinate the reality we see in a controlled manner. Don Quixote was the first literary character to show this psychological mechanism with total clarity. His struggle to maintain his vision of the world in the face of contrary evidence is the same struggle we face when trying to navigate a sea of fake news and alternative realities. Furthermore, the concept of psychological resilience finds a role model in the Knight of the Sorrowful Countenance. Despite receiving countless beatings, mockery, and failures, Don Quixote always gets back up. His ability to find an explanation that preserves his dignity and his mission, usually by blaming malicious enchanters who steal his victory, is a fascinating defense mechanism. It speaks to the need to maintain hope even when everything seems to indicate we are defeated. In a modern world marked by cynicism and disenchantment, the figure of Quixote emerges as a reminder that nobility of spirit and the struggle for an ideal, however absurd it may seem to others, is what grants us our true humanity. It is not about winning the battle, but about having the courage to fight it. This is the essence of what the philosopher Miguel de Unamuno called the tragic sense of life, that constant tension between our desire for immortality and justice and the reality of our finitude in a world often indifferent to good and evil. The deconstruction of Quixote also allows us to talk about the power of literature to transform society. Cervantes did not just write a book, he changed how we think about language and national identity. The Spanish spoken today is deeply permeated by the cadence and vocabulary of Cervantes. But beyond the linguistic, Don Quixote taught us to laugh at ourselves. Cervantine humor is not a destructive mockery, it is an irony full of love. It invites us to recognize our own follies and weaknesses with a smile, reminding us that no one possesses the absolute truth. In an era of polarization and fanaticism, returning to the pages of Quixote is an act of mental health. It teaches us that between black and white, there is an infinite range of grays, and that the dialogue between the knight and the squire is the only path to harmonious coexistence. As contemporary narrative experts would say, Don Quixote is the prototype of the anti-hero, that flawed and sometimes ridiculous character with whom we feel much more identified than with the perfect and unreachable heroes of ancient epics. If we delve into the symbolism of the work, we find that every object and every encounter carries a weight of meaning that transcends the surface. The lance, the shield, the skinny horse called Rocinante, they are all extensions of the will to power of a man who refuses to be invisible. La Mancha itself, a geographic location that Cervantes describes with some reluctance at first, becomes, thanks to the novel, a mythical space, a geography of the soul where anything is possible. The contrast between the blinding light of day and the shadows of the inns where they stay reinforces the atmosphere of a dream or nightmare that often envelops their adventures. The novel is also a catalogue of life in the 17th century. We find barbers, priests, innkeepers, muleteers, bandits, expelled Moriscos, and shepherd poets. Each of them contributes a piece to the puzzle of a society in crisis desperately seeking a new direction. Cervantes, with an almost sociological sensitivity, captures the pulse of a nation torn between nostalgia for the past and the uncertainty of the future. This leads us to ask a fundamental question that has resonated for centuries. Was Don Quixote really mad, or was he a visionary who preferred his own truth to the degraded reality that surrounded him? The answer, of course, is not simple. His madness is instrumental. It is a tool for liberation. By declaring himself mad to the world, he gains the freedom to act outside the restrictive social norms of his time. He can speak of love with a purity that would seem ridiculous in a sane man. He can defend the oppressed regardless of legal consequences, and he can seek beauty in the most unexpected places. It is a quixotic madness that, at its heart, is a superior form of sanity. It is the sanity of the heart that refuses to accept that the world is only what we touch and see. It is the conviction that a poetic justice exists that must be pursued, even if it is never fully reached in this plane of existence. In considering Cervantes' legacy, we cannot ignore how his own life of suffering shaped this work. A man who spent years captive in Algiers, waiting for a ransom that did not come, learned that the only freedom no one can take from you is the freedom of thought and imagination. Don Quixote is, in many ways, the triumph of a man who lost everything except his ability to create. This is why the work resonates so strongly in any culture and in any language. It is not a story about Spain. It is a story about the human spirit facing adversity. It is a hymn to the dignity of the individual against the structures of power that attempt to dehumanize them. The enduring relevance of Don Quixote lies in the fact that it offers us a mirror where we can see our own struggles, our own fears, and above all, our inexhaustible capacity to dream of a better world. Therefore, as we close this analysis, we must understand that reading Quixote is not an exercise in literary archaeology, but a living and pulsating encounter with ourselves. Every time we defend a lost cause, every time we choose compassion over cruelty, every time we dare to imagine a reality different from the one imposed upon us, we are invoking the spirit of the Knight of the Sorrowful Countenance. Cervantes' work is an eternal gift that reminds us that life is an adventure that deserves to be lived with passion, with humor, and with a pinch of that blessed madness that allows us to see giants where others only see windmills. At the end of the road, what remains are not the wounds or the defeats, but the indelible mark of having walked through the world with our head held high and our heart full of ideals. Don Quixote is not just a book, it is a moral compass, a refuge for the soul, and the ultimate proof that the written word has the power to transform reality and make us, for a moment, truly free. It is imperative that we continue to travel those roads of La Mancha, for in every corner of that dusty plain, a lesson awaits us about who we are and who we can become if we have the courage to saddle our own Rocinante and set out to find our destiny. Thank you very much for joining me on this journey of deep exploration through the pages of Cervantes' masterpiece. I hope this reflection inspires you to rediscover the magic of literature and to always keep your own idealism alive. Until our paths cross again in the vast territory of letters and philosophy,